on American involvement in Vietnam. Okay, my name is Darren Bardell, and I teach at Hawaii College. This is a history lecture on American involvement in Vietnam. This is titled The Phases of the Vietnamese Conflict. In order for students to fully understand America's involvement in Vietnam, there's three key concepts that are overlapping and at play throughout our 30-year involvement in this conflict. So I'm going to start with them as a form of background. Now, these are concepts that shaped American decision-making, why policymakers chose the course of action that they did along the way. The first is the concept of what I call the Cold War blinders. Now, blinders, what I'm talking about when I use that term, are the type that horses wear when they run a race or when they exercise in preparation for a race. Blinders go on either side of the horse's eyes. The idea is to keep that horse focused only on what's in front of it. Either open track, the finish line, or other horses, and not to focus on what's happening. Is the notion of a prism. And it bends it, distorts it, and it breaks it down into its Roy G. Biv breakdown: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, etc. Okay, so the way that the Cold War prism and the Cold War blinders work in Vietnam is that U.S. policymakers had these blinders on. In other words, they looked at Vietnam, what was happening there, and they made decisions with these blinders on. So they could only see kind of what they wanted to see, or what they needed to see based on the theories and principles they developed with the Cold War against the Soviet Union. So Vietnam becomes a pawn in this larger Cold War game between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and then eventually China. And the second concept here, this prism, that's related to that, is that when you, like for example, that Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the nationalist leader of the North, when they saw that he was a socialist or a communist, the prism didn't allow them to see the reality that he was first and foremost a Vietnamese nationalist, that he had a nationalist movement to liberate Vietnam from imperialist occupation. And that this had been going on, then with the French, and then with the Japanese, who occupied, as we know, Vietnam through World War II. So when the U.S. come into it, and they are seen as an occupying nation by the Vietnamese people, especially the Vietnamese people of the North, and by Ho Chi Minh, the U.S. don't see it that way. They see the reality based on their Cold War philosophy and doctrines. Okay. The second notion here is the idea of incrementalism. Now, the way this affected U.S. policymaking in Vietnam is this. One president would make a decision about Vietnam and about how many troops to have there, about what to do, where to bomb. Then that president would either leave office or be voted out of office. And another president would come in. And they would incrementally take the U.S. deeper into the involvement into Vietnam. And so by the third or fourth president, they don't even remember why the first president had us involved in Vietnam in the first place. That's so far removed because of this long, incremental, slow process of becoming involved in Vietnam. And so they're making decisions without even realizing how deep their nation is in. And the other problem with incrementalism is that it's hard to get out because you're so deep in the process by the time you come along and you're making decisions, because you've incrementally committed yourself to this event, to this war, that it's very hard to pull yourself out. Okay. Last, and probably the most significant factor that affected decision-making on the negative side, poor decision-making, was an ignorance of Vietnamese culture and history. that almost universally was shared among American policymakers throughout all these phases I'm going to lecture on today. The idea here is that U.S. decision makers, people working in the State Department, who gave advice to the high-level people, they did not have a background in Vietnamese culture. And so they would make decisions that were ignorant or ignored the subtleties that happened within a culture. So to give one basic example here, we had a policy that came into effect about 15 years into the war, where American servicemen were rounding up villagers and taking out safe zones. And the idea was that they would protect them from the communist forces in the area, and it'd be easier to watch over them if they relocated them to an area that American forces had secured. The problem with that is the Vietnamese, part of their and they buried their ancestors on their property, on their land, and so their land becomes sacred at that point. And so you can't remove people off of land, but now when the land itself has become sacred to them. And so this caused a big disconnect and problem between the American policymakers and the Vietnamese. And it actually alienated the Vietnamese civilian population against the U.S. forces. Okay. All of those things will conspire as we look at these next few phases of American involvement. Phase 1 begins from 46 to 54, so 1946 to 1954. It is what I call the money phase. And really the only way that we're involved in Vietnam at this phase is that we are supporting the French occupation or reoccupation of Vietnam. We learned from our lecture on World War II that after the war, after the Japanese were defeated, they left their occupation of Vietnam, and the French came back in. They were there before the Japanese came in and pushed them out. And so, right off the bat, that would leave a very good taste in the Vietnamese people's mouth, right? They've got the occupation of the French, they're pushed out, occupied by the Japanese, they're pushed out, and then occupied by the French. Now, the U.S. supported the French in Vietnam for that first phase that I'm talking about there, from 1946 to 1954, until a very important event happened where the Vietnamese were significantly defeated in a famous battle and gave up the fight. So that gets us into our next phase of U.S. involvement, phase 2, the Eisenhower phase, what I call sink or swim with Diem. Diem, spelled D-I-E-M, was the leader of South Vietnam. One of the more interesting things about Diem was that he was a Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist nation, and he was an aristocrat in France, and very aloof and separated from the average poor Vietnamese peasant. And so not a very popular leader, to say the least. However, as we know from the Cold War and the philosophy and the strategy of U.S. policy during the Cold War, we always support pro-Western leaders. Whether they be dictators, popular, unpopular, doesn't matter. What matters is, do they support the United States? Do they want to institute open markets, free markets, and capitalism? And Diem did. Now, during this phase 2, the U.S. is only involved through the CIA, so very covertly. If you asked any American in the 1950s if they even knew where Vietnam was, or had ever even heard of the nation, very few people would answer in the affirmative. So it's during this period we're trying to covertly support the Diem regime and government in the South. That begins to fall apart and dismantle near the end of Eisenhower's presidency. And so the next phase comes in with a new president, and again, this concept of incrementalism we start to play out here. So JFK comes into office. He's elected, of course, we know, in 1960, takes control in 1961. And I call this phase, phase 3, JFK's counterinsurgency phase. So the U.S. is involved during this phase through a new doctrine that, again, is called counterinsurgency, where the U.S. is going to send military advisors to train the South Vietnamese on how to resist and fight against the North Vietnamese. This phase ends very simply with the assassination of JFK. So he, some believe, wanted to pull the U.S. out of Vietnam, but the theory goes, didn't have the opportunity to because he was assassinated before he finished his term in office. So phase 4 begins with the election, or the assumption of office by Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, in what I call the blank check Americanization of the war. Now, this is the period, the phase of Vietnam that most of us are familiar with, or have family who are familiar with. The mid-60s, 1965 to give it an exact date, where Johnson goes before Congress and says, I want this nation, I need you, Congress, to approve increased involvement of U.S. troops in the southern Vietnamese region to support the government there and to resist northern aggression or northern communism from taking over the nation. And so at this point, Johnson significantly increases American troop involvement and, like I said, Americanizes the war effort. So again, under Eisenhower and JFK, we have the Vietnamese doing the primary fighting, and they're being supported by money first, and then training, covert operations. Now, Americans themselves, American Army, Navy, and Marines are going to go into Vietnam, and they're going to take an active role in actually fighting against the Vietnamese from the north. Okay. This, from the very beginning, was a gray policy, meaning not a lot of it was spelled out in black and white to the American people or to the members of Congress. In fact, Congress sort of liked it that way. They decided early on that, when this is, again, part of the Cold War principle and policies, that the president, as commander-in-chief, should be unfettered to fight wars without a lot of congressional oversight. It just was more effective that way. It worked great in World War II, of course, as we know, and so that was the way to go with Vietnam. And so the American people, as a result, were kept out of the loop. When they were brought into the loop, when American reporters did go to Vietnam and interview the troops, they kept getting the same party line, which was, we're winning this war, we should have it wrapped up within a year or two, and we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Okay, so that was the official party line that LBJ promoted and pushed. But again, the American public did not want to know about Vietnam. They weren't told much about Vietnam. And when they were told about Vietnam, they were told very plainly by the Department of Defense and by the President that the U.S. was winning the war. That all ended in 1968. So 1968 becomes a very important date for American involvement in Vietnam. It's sort of the high point, and from that point, it's just downhill to an eventual failure and full-out withdrawal from Vietnam. So this introduces the next phase, phase 5, which I call Tet and the credibility gap. Okay, a credibility gap is a gap in what someone tells you and what is the reality. And so somebody who lies to you a lot has very little credibility with you. Okay, so Eisenhower and then Kennedy they had a lot of credibility with the American people. Eisenhower, because he was the commander-in-chief of all the forces in World War II. Kennedy, because he was very charismatic and had a way with the American media. Now, Johnson was a very charming president as well. The problem was he was not telling the American public the full truth about America's shortcomings, problems, and events in Vietnam. And so what happens in 1968 is, of course, the Tet Offensive. And I've lectured on this before, the very important offensive. In one single day, approximately 25 American bases and military installations were attacked simultaneously in the South. And so what that does is, to an outside observer looking at this, it tells you that the Vietnamese in the North were able to coordinate over a long period of time a lot of troops to do this offensive and attack all these military installations. That's one thing it tells you. Number two, it tells you that they must have had to help or support by the people of the South. So the Vietnamese people living in the South must have either hidden these troops or outright supported or helped them in these offenses. Now, that's after we have been told that LBJ and the Pentagon giving these formal press releases and statements saying that America was winning the war, that the South wanted us there, that they supported us over the North Vietnamese. And so what this event clearly showed was that that wasn't true. There was a credibility gap over what the Pentagon was saying, the President was saying about the South, and what was the truth on the ground. The next thing it tells you and shows you is that this war is far from over. And remember, we've been told that the President and the Pentagon had kept putting out messages, and I showed you some of these videos in class, that the famous metaphor was, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Any day now, this war is going to be over. Well, Tet proved that that was not the case, that this war could probably go on for much longer. Okay. Based on this clear political victory by the North Vietnamese, their attempt, of course, to unify the country, Johnson decides that he's not going to run for re-election in 1968. So basically this ruined Johnson's re-election chances. It opens the door for Richard Nixon to come into politics again, come back into politics, and run for the presidency in 1968 and win. Okay, so phase 6 of this is, again, probably a phase your family, people who you may have talked to about Vietnam, will remember very distinctly. And that's the 2 terms of Richard Nixon. I call this the Vietnamization of the war, 1968 to 1975. In this phase 6, Nixon decides that yes, we're still going to support the Vietnamese, we're going to send American troops to fight in Vietnam, but we want to put more of the burden on the Vietnamese people themselves, the Vietnamese soldiers, the Vietnamese citizens. So we're going to recruit more Vietnamese for the military services, and we're going to put the fighting more on their shoulders. Okay, you probably have heard something very similar in discussions of Afghanistan and Iraq today, where the American occupational forces are there, and they are starting to scale down and withdraw, and the idea is that they're going to leave the fighting and the defense of their nation to the people of Afghanistan or Iraq, respectively. This is very much what they were trying to do here in Vietnam. The problem was, in this phase, in this period, that the Vietnamese people did not want to take on this responsibility. This was not a very popular war to begin with, and they were not capable, for whatever reason, and we can discuss those later, of putting up a good defense against the North. And so it's in this phase that, in order to sort of continue to take the fight to the Vietnamese, Nixon makes the fateful decision to bomb the North. So just to give you a sense of scale on bombing of the North, the U.S. will drop more tonnage of bombs on North Vietnam than all of the armies dropped in World War II combined. That's the U.S., the British, the Germans, the Italians, the Japanese. We will drop more bombs in this phase and under Richard Nixon on the North than all of the armies dropped in World War II combined. Okay, so that'll give you a sense of the scale of this new Vietnamization process under Richard Nixon. This all comes to a screeching halt in 1973, and it rages on for about 5 years there, but to no avail, and it was not successful in bringing the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table. In fact, it failed miserably. It turned international opinion against the United States, and so Nixon throws in the towel. There's a very famous peace delegation that meets up in Paris, and they sign an agreement, and the U.S. begins to withdraw forces from South Vietnam. The story is not over yet. In the process of withdrawing forces from 1973 to 1975, the North scales up its occupation or reoccupation of the South. And little by little, town by town, region by region, South Vietnam is becoming engulfed by North Vietnamese communist forces. It all comes to a head in 1975 with what they call the Fall of Saigon, where the last U.S. forces completely withdraw while there's an advancing Vietnamese army coming into the city of Saigon. Of course, now renamed Ho Chi Minh City. To the victor goes the spoils. Okay, so what else is distinctive about phase 6? Well, it is in this phase that we start to hear a lot of very negative things about the way the U.S. conducted the war from the Vietnamese, the American veterans themselves. It is in this phase where a very negative episode where American soldiers killed Vietnamese civilians breaks the media. There's a very famous trial of soldiers, American soldiers, who went into a village and systematically exterminated civilians. It's also when we start hearing first about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And the Vietnam veterans are having a tough time coping with the horror of combat they experienced, and this starts to make international and national news in the United States. And there's really very inadequate treatment for these veterans at first, and they begin slowly, the Veterans Administration, to deal with this. We also hear for the first time about a substance called Agent Orange in this phase. And we realize, or we first hear about how this chemical developed by Dow was systematically dropped all over the North and the South to defoliate the jungle, to remove foliage from the jungle so that it was easier to see the enemy. The problem was that this chemical developed by Dow, Agent Orange, was a carcinogen, and the troops who applied it and the civilian population that were exposed to it started to develop cancer, especially their children. Okay. America's leaving Vietnam was probably the low point of our foreign policy. Of all time, this is the low point of our foreign policy, of our national identity. Even with Pearl Harbor, that was a a failure and a loss of life, but it was a sneak attack. We didn't have a chance of defending ourselves the way Americans viewed that event. This was clearly a failure of American forces, American military. And so the 1970s, midway through the 1970s to the end of the decade, become what I call the Vietnam Syndrome phase. So that's phase 7. And that phase leads us directly to the last phase, and that is the reinvention of Vietnam in American history books, in American public media, in the American consciousness. And that effort was led by Ronald Reagan and his administration, as they had to still deal with a Cold War threat, a Soviet Union within a Cold War context, but an American public that had a very strong distaste for war in its mouth after failure in Vietnam. So that concludes this lecture on the Vietnam phases, American involvement in the conflict, and I hope you enjoyed that lecture. Thank you.